Hello and welcome. A special welcome to all those who are new to the group. And today's session, we will be covering executive business reviews. And for those who are new to the group, we want to introduce what the Vancouver Customer Success Meetup group is all about. It's about connecting the community and sharing experiences and learning, helping develop careers, and creating Vancouver as a global hub for customer success. These events are planned by a small group of us, and these folks on the screen are the planners, organizers of the events. And without further wait, we're going to start today and introduce the guests. And then at the end of today's session, we will leave time for a Q&A period. So first off, we have Jillian Taylor here today. And then we also have Peter Armley. And Jillian is a customer success leader in Vancouver. She's currently a manager of customer success, and she's very passionate about cross-functional collaboration and has a focus on customer and user experience. She's also the facilitator and coach of the CS Circle. And our second guest doesn't need much of an introduction. You've probably seen Peter around at many different customer success thought leadership events. He is a frequent speaker, and he's enthusiastic about harnessing customer listening to improve the customer experience. And last year, he was named a top 25 customer success influencer by Success Hacker. And so Jillian and Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Jackie. And thank you very much for having me on here to have this discussion with Peter. And thanks for Peter to make this happen as well. So we're going to do kind of an interview style. From here, I'll let Peter take it away, and we'll start a discussion. We may, and I'll say now too, if you want to add anything in the chat, we'll definitely have time for a Q&A after we've done the sort of interview. Maybe throw some ideas out there for discussion as we go as well.
Yeah, so hello everybody, and thank you, Jackie, for the introduction. This topic, of course, is a perennial kind of hot topic in customer success. I think oftentimes people bounce it around because they avoid it and they don't want to really deal with it, but it's important. And it helps this conversation, I think, if we just establish kind of a general kind of definition, a framework for what a EBR is. So what you see on the screen is things that we've come up with, a list of objectives that generally you'd like to see accomplished in an executive business review. You know, reviewing the investment value for the customer, because that's obviously important to them. You know, reviewing accomplishments and achievements, showing progress, gaining a deeper understanding of their business. Take that opportunity when you meet with them to go deeper about the challenges that they're facing, the opportunities that they hope to pursue, and capture feedback all the time, right? So EBRs shouldn't just be seen as an opportunity to talk to executives. Other people will be in the room too, and so you should always seek opportunities to get feedback about your services, your product, the partnership you have with the company, and then highlight product use cases and future roadmap features is something we thought should be included in an EBR, and align on key business initiatives and objectives and associated timelines. That's basically going forward. This is like kind of a path going forward. So that in mind, the way I view kind of in three kind of statements about EBRs, I think it helps to frame EBRs as you need to understand there needs to be a purpose to these things. If you don't have a clear purpose for an EBR, don't even think about scheduling one, because if you don't have a clear purpose, it's going to show when you actually conduct the meeting. You know, you need to deliver EBRs with an expectation that there's value for both sides. So it's not just about delivering information to the client. It's actually, you want to gain something from the EBRs as well. And you should have in your mind what the hoped for outcomes are for both parties. So remember, just kind of overall, EBR should be an opportunity to really demonstrate the true partnership in business. So let's go start into the interview. Jillian, with that framing in mind, what would you suggest should be kind of the frequency of an EBR?
Yeah, so that was, we figured off the top in terms of how we frame this discussion for everyone, that we would start with the purpose, and then we'll get into the preparation and the execution kind of in those separate categories. So to answer the question of how often, if you're thinking that this is executive, so you're going to have not just your day-to-day client or customer in the room, this is an opportunity where you're going to have a higher level discussion. So it makes sense to do it once a year. In terms of when in the year, that's another aspect to consider. So it actually could be less than once a year. I mean, the point is that there needs to be value for the customer, but once a year is probably when you're the cadence for doing an executive business review, just because of the level of depth that you'll go into and the stakeholders that you'll have in the room with you.
Yeah, I think that's accurate, because again, zeroing in on the word executive, their time is precious, and you really want to make sure that if you're meeting with them, that there's clear value that they will derive from the meeting. So, as you said, Jillian, I think it depends on the business and the engagement level that you're having and where they are in their journey, how critical it is. And so, but generally speaking, I think once a year with an executive client is appropriate. And also bearing in mind that you're not the only vendor they're dealing with, right? There's probably other vendors that they're talking to and also wanting to schedule time with them. So, in terms of EBRs, are there other types of meetings or reviews that accomplish, something similar to EBRs that maybe it could be seen as you could schedule those more frequently or kind of a different format? What are your thoughts on that, Jillian?
Yes, definitely. This is where you can really go down a rabbit hole of, first of all, not everyone calls an executive business review an EBR as such, partly because of that. Sometimes I've talked to other leaders and they justify not having an EBR once a year because they're in such frequent close contact with their customer. But when all of us had this discussion, we came to the consensus that it does make sense to have that executive level review with your economic decision maker there in attendance. Typically that high level, that decision maker isn't necessarily there day to day, and you can't rely on regular communications even that maybe are landing in their inbox, but they're not necessarily seeing them. And the other part of doing an executive business review is that bi-directional aspect that you wouldn't get from any kind of a one-way communication. And by making sure that that's the premise of the exercise, that's really where it comes to an EBR. But you can still accomplish everything that goes into an EBR in smaller chunks too, with maybe different stakeholders. So all of it ties in together, like the outcomes based on what are the goals of the customer and how your solution, your product application is actually solving to achieve those outcomes.
So, yeah, so you're saying understand the audience then and their needs and their expectations. So there might be room to have a separate meeting for, depending on the stakeholders, something that might be more specific to, as you said, the value review, or something even more tactical. I guess the point is that the reviews are an opportunity to shed light on accomplishments and agree on any sort of go forward path, or agree on what obstacles are ahead that maybe you need to collaborate on. If you don't have these meetings, I think you're really exposing yourself to some vulnerability to being seen as not so strategic anymore. So you might be working day to day with your individual kind of contacts, but if you're not kind of summarizing on a somewhat regular basis, whether it's annual or semi-annual, I think then the leadership team might not view you as a strategic partner. So that's just something to bear in mind. So, you started that off, Jillian, by saying some people think, well, I'm in contact with my regular contact all the time, and it's not necessary. It actually is necessary to bring it up a level. So let's move on to the preparation for EBRs. So do you review the content with your day-to-day customer champion prior to the meetings?
Yeah, absolutely. And the more time you bake in and plan to do this, the better, because it's all about the quality and the value that you're adding here. So if I found in personal experience where it's more about, so this isn't how I think it should be, but this is in my experience, the pressure to just get this business review delivered and then end up lacking the benefit of it all, because it was more about doing this every quarter, even if it was a quarterly business review, or worrying more about that than actually putting in the preparation that is needed to get the value that is important to achieve. So yeah, so definitely getting your customer, your day-to-day champion to participate in the preparation. So whether it's like, have the goals and objectives changed since we first established those together? Sometimes they change, and then your day-to-day contact realizes, oh no, we haven't talked about that. So definitely, number one, get aligned on that. And then even more detailed than that, of having them add to the actual presentation itself, if that's what it is. Well, we can talk about that as well a little bit of, does it have to be a deck as well? That's another modern way to and creative aspect of all of this is we don't have to do it in a traditional PowerPoint deck. There's other ways to achieve an executive business review, but either way, you want to involve your day-to-day champion.
Yeah, 100%. That's my experience. I think that's just best practice that people believe is true. And I think it's because many of us have experienced when you actually work with your champion to develop or to refine the content prior to the meeting, it's a much more powerful and relevant meeting for the customer, because oftentimes they'll invite their bosses to the meeting, and they want to make sure that everything goes well and that you're hitting all the right points. So my experience is my best customer ever, he actually insisted on quarterly business reviews, and he and I would collaborate for the 2 weeks prior to the EBR to make sure that all the right objectives were being discussed, and I was doing my research and making sure I prepared everything, and then they always went really well. So 100% agree with that. So do you send the agenda or the slide deck even to the meeting participants? I'm not just talking about the champion, but the actual participants prior to the meeting?
So the agenda, yes, especially for, well, any stakeholder, but when we're thinking of executive level too, people need to know what their meeting that they're agreeing to attend to is about, or maybe they won't even accept the meeting invite if they don't know the agenda and the objective of the meeting. So definitely send the agenda in advance. However, sending the entire deck isn't my preference. There may be use cases or situations where that makes sense. That's the one thing when we're talking about any topic in customer success, is there's always it depends that can go in front of everything, because we all have a different business model, different product use case, and there's even different levels of stakeholders when it comes to influencing the decision to renew the subscription. At the end of the day, that's the ultimate goal, is that our customers are staying with us, and they're not finding reasons to say that they're not, or find that they're not getting value. So if there's a lot of different levels to consider in your audience, then the other thing about sending the deck in advance is the context is missing too.
Yeah.
So if you send it in advance, they're not necessarily going to look at it. If they do look at it, they might feel like they don't need to attend anymore. And I mean, there's a few things really. It's like they then, rather than focusing on the preparation aspect, which hopefully in the agenda and the key objectives that are part of the agenda, they can prepare, but just not misinterpret maybe what might be in the deck.
Yeah, I agree. Decks without a lot of, if you're going to send a deck, make sure you've got tons of notes included in the deck so you explain everything, but that's not a great idea because people probably won't read it anyways, the notes. And so you leave too much opportunity for misinterpretation and prejudgment and all that stuff. So I wouldn't recommend sending a deck unless, like you said, Jillian, there's probably maybe some exceptions that are very specific that make sense, but I would say generally speaking, it's probably not wise to do that. So who else should be involved in the preparation of the EBR?
Yeah, in the preparation on your own end of things. So the sales probably one of your sales managers, executives, however your team is structured, makes sense to involve them because maybe they're heavily involved and they have a relationship, or maybe there's an opportunity here. There may be questions about is there expansion that would make sense? You know, it's there not just to be able to sell to the customer, but if the customer has questions related to their contract and the subscription available to them, then you want to be able to answer those questions. And by having all of the relevant stakeholders in the room, it shows how much you value their business too. That's the way I look at it. I don't think it should be a case of sometimes, you know, it's something to think about of like intimidating the customer by having a lot of people on your end in the call. But as long as there's a purpose and there's relevancy, you know, sometimes, especially with key accounts, it might really make sense. And especially a smaller company, you might even have your CEO there because maybe there's a relationship that is being had between executive stakeholder on the customer side and your side. Once again, that really depends on the relationship.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think you need to understand that if the customer is going to have senior executives in the room, you probably should have your senior executives along, because you know, it's not great, but that's just the reality of our business world, is that people like to kind of mirror the roles on the other side. And I think there's, sure, we can talk about respect and not respect and all that kind of stuff, but I think that's just the reality. And so, you know, as you said, Jillian, maybe that's just good for business anyways, because then they can have kind of side conversations, you know, afterwards or beforehand. But yeah, I agree with that, everything you said. And I would say in my past, I've also invited solution engineers or pre-sales consultants, depending on what I knew the customer might be interested in exploring with a little bit more depth. I might not have them on the agenda, but I would have a role for them to maybe elaborate or explain something or answer some questions and that sort of thing. Just depends on what business is transpiring with the customer. So let's talk then about execution. You know, typically we think about PowerPoint decks, but are there alternative formats, or does it always have to be a deck?
Well, yeah, that is what actually in preparing for this conversation, it was really cool to hear other people's experience with doing some really cool engagement activities. So still preparation involved in advance, but something like doing a mural board exercise or a whiteboarding exercise where I would say that you'd still want to have some key points that you would maybe have a couple of slides, I would say, just to add context at the beginning. And from my point of view of coming back to what the objectives are, but if you can really make it engaging so that the customer is really involved with what where we are now and where we're headed, and actually kind of having that interactive, collaborative approach to achieving goals and how we're going to do that with the product. Because I think there's a lot of learning that actually takes place in that time that we spend. It's probably an hour, but by the time people connect and at the beginning, and then questions that take a little longer to discuss, really an hour ends up flying by. But if you can spend less time talking and facilitate more opportunity for the customer to actually, for you to learn more from them and about their business, then I think doing something that requires two-way conversation, like a Miro board exercise, you can do it in the form of a SWOT analysis with your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. It's really good to hear the threats, actually, like, from both sides, because otherwise that's something that people tend to not talk about. And it makes sense to either mitigate that risk. Sometimes it can be done right then and there, or it's something to take away. And if you're doing this exercise well enough in advance of a renewal date that might be in the future, then you've got time to actually address these kinds of maybe the feedback that you get.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on kind of the theme that what you really need to pay attention to is engagement of the audience, and so the default of using a PowerPoint can be hazardous if used incorrectly or badly, because as we all know, they can be exceedingly dull depending on the delivery. And so any sort of tactic you can use to engage the audience, even if it's with a PowerPoint deck, but you can kind of get them involved by asking open-ended questions and really being more consultative, even during the EBR, is probably a really good idea to maintain their attention, their interest, and make you memorable, right? Because again, going back to they probably have multiple vendors. You actually want to try and stand out, even if they're not competitors. You want to make them remember you as a company. And so, yeah, I like the idea of really examining your format and the vehicle you use to communicate the information.
Yeah, I mean, and one thing I can add to that too is the idea of doing a real-time survey, or like some polling questions to kind of direct the conversation as well, and maybe just as a jumping off point for the business review. So whether it's like after you've done an initial introduction, so that's another way that's maybe partway between, in terms of you also don't necessarily want your customer to feel like they're in the hot seat if they don't really have something to contribute to. So yeah, you really have to know your audience in this case. And but yeah, and
I was gonna say, hopefully if you've worked with your champion, they will maybe jump in if there's not much kind of engagement on their side. Maybe they'll get that energy kind of generated or triggered, right? So
yeah, and actually I thought this might be a good time, if anybody has any cool ideas, throw them in the chat, and then we can come back to those when we get through our questions.
Okay, so Suman has his hand raised, but there's also a question I want to get to in the chat. But let's go to Suman, since he's actually going to ask something about this specific topic.
Yeah, it's kind of on the execution front for the EBRs, and this is more like a thought and then also a question at the end of it. What I have done before and what has really worked for us is also kind of the CSN presenting, like co-presenting along with the champion, who also happens to be a power user. Mm-hmm. The reason why it has worked very well is because it kind of ensures engagement, and it also kind of emphasizes that mutual ownership and accountability of not just the opportunities, but also the risks and issues. So it becomes more like a collective effort rather than just a one side from the vendor to the customer.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
No, well, I like it. I think it's a good idea. Collaboration is good. I think going back to what I said at the very beginning, I believe in the best businesses are the ones where you actually have a true partnership, which means there's a lot of understanding that the value has to go both ways. Jillian, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's a really great call out there about actually involving your champion in the delivery too, in the execution, because yeah, I have this noted to make sure that at some point I say this, is that this is also an opportunity for you to really have your day-to-day contact or your champion stand out to their boss who's on the call too, like of all the great work and what they've achieved. And then win-win. If it's been with your product, then that's the whole objective there, is to show the achievements on both sides.
Yeah. So speaking of presenting, then there's a question from Matt in the chat, which I think is pertinent. So he wants to know, does it dilute or reduce the CSM's role to have this customer success leader present in the EBR? And I presume by leader meaning that it's the CSM's boss or executive, whatever. What are your thoughts on that, Jillian?
That's a good one. I suppose without context, I mean, that maybe does depend on the situation, but more or less, I feel like if the customer success manager has that relationship and is closest to the product, how the customer is getting value from the product, it does make sense for them to present. But maybe there's some reason why it would be a manager level or director presenting. So yeah, if anybody has any examples of why that might be the case, but I feel like whoever has that deep knowledge and, you know, in the title is customer success manager. So yeah, I think it makes sense for them to deliver.
I think it's the way I think about this is that at least in enterprise business, you know, no one would question whether an account executive or an account manager should be the one presenting the review. Everyone just assumes they will because they quote unquote own the account. Now, I think of it the same way in the post-sales world, that the CSM should be the lead on this. Yeah, absolutely, their boss should be present. But I would, if I'm the boss, actually, I would want the CSM. I don't care if there's senior executives in the audience, I still expect the CSM to have the skills and the knowledge of the account to be able to present. I might want to contribute and maybe add a little bit of context or color, but I think the CSM should know they should be expected to take the lead on the presentation.
Yeah.
Okay, what about roadmaps? Upcoming features, should those things be included in the EBR discussion?
Yeah, that one is debatable. The way I look at it is I would definitely include any product features, roadmap, anything along those lines, like upcoming, if it's completely relevant to the customer's goals and objectives. So maybe there's something that they're doing and there's an upcoming feature that's going to really facilitate their success, then I would want to highlight that. I wouldn't bury the lead on that one. The thing that is really important to be careful of, and every software developer or product team member will be thankful of this, and actually you would thank yourself too, don't promise any dates of like release dates, because as we know, you don't have to be working in tech very long, that usually changes. And so whether it's the date itself, or even be careful, like how far down the road is this product feature from being built? Like sometimes things change. So just be mindful of that in the presentation and the sharing of that kind of information. However, yeah, I would say it's an opportunity. This is a perfect opportunity to highlight the future and what's coming, and especially if the customer was a part of making that design come to life. Maybe they provided some of the feedback that actually directed and made this new feature come to life. So
yeah, that's an excellent point. That's an opportunity to reinforce the value of the voice of the customer. If that's the program that was in place that collected that feedback, that's a way to demonstrate how you can loop back to customers, and they find that extremely valuable. And it drives up loyalty when you do that. You know, I think with product roadmaps, you need to be really careful. You touched on that, Jillian, that in large companies, when I was at Oracle, and it's basically there's legal ramifications for sharing certain information. And usually, almost always, if we felt that was necessary to talk about roadmaps, we'd bring in the product team to do that. CSMs would not be responsible for stating futures. We were actually told we should not do that, and we understood why. But product roadmaps are sometimes of interest, right, to customers. So it's one of those things where you need to kind of do your work up front, understand what their expectations and hopes are, and see if you can satisfy that. If it's features that, as you said, Jillian, and this is the critical piece for CSMs to understand, and you should only talk about the ones that matter to them, to their business, to something that might help solve a business challenge, anything of interest that way. If you just go through a litany of here's what's coming in the product, that's just going to drive the audience crazy and probably away. And so that speaks to the engagement and how you can influence that. So yeah, roadmaps, features, sometimes good, sometimes bad, I would say. All depends. So what can you do, Jillian? I don't want to say this is the kind of the last summary question, but when you think about EBRs, is there a recipe for having successful EBRs?
Well, number one, I would say for any interaction presentation is the preparation. That's really important. If you haven't prepared and it's sort of a cookie cutter experience for the customer, that's not going to be good use of anyone's time. And in fact, it could have a negative effect too, really. So I think, yeah, definitely number one, the preparation. And then our discussion that we had today is, a lot of what needs to go into the preparation. And to guide that, definitely use empathy. So it's like what really matters to the customer. So there's sometimes, the goals and objectives, but in the preparation, you're going to make sure that those are still accurate. And and think of the different stakeholders too. So like what really matters to one stakeholder is not going to be the same agenda as it is for somebody else too. So I think to kind of cover all the bases of all the different SaaS companies out there and different products out there, those would apply in every case.
Yeah. I think there's no perfect recipe for EBRs because they are really specific to your business and your customer's business. But I think there's generally kind of some rules of thumb. Obviously, preparation. I think understanding, as you said, who the stakeholders are, as best you can understand what's the audience going to be, and what are their hopes from these meetings. What's the history of their engagement? Have you learned from past ones that you can figure out how to kind of improve how you're delivering these EBRs? What you don't want to have happen is you have a series of EBRs where it gets less and less interesting to the customer, to the point where you have a dwindling audience each time. That's really a bad sign. And I'm not saying that that's a strong precursor to a churn, but I would say it's not a great sign. And so you need to pay attention to those kinds of things. And I think what compounds it these days is a lot of these things are done virtually. So that raises challenges, right? And maybe you can talk a little bit about that, Jillian, is in person versus virtual. Are there things that can be accentuated in virtual that, maybe are, I don't know, maybe the reverse is a better question.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, actually, I'm so used to this method of meeting with people now that I almost forgot about that in-person option. And I would say, like, I really noticed this at the beginning of the pandemic and this whole virtual experience, is that you can actually get more people in the room than you would when it was virtual. And depends where you would normally meet in person. I mean, if you're going to visit a customer, then you have a good chance of getting a lot of those stakeholders in the room if it's on site at their own home place. But now that everybody is spread out so much more because the pandemic allowed for that, I think we're still, no matter what way you look at it, if you do it virtually, you can have a better probability of getting more key stakeholders in the room on both sides, both organizations on the customer side and the and your own product side. So yeah, I think that's one thing. Something that jumping back to the question about ensuring successful EBRs that you touched on, Peter, is like thinking of how things went in the past. Well, that's really important right after doing an EBR, whatever that experience looked like, is to reflect on it and involve your customer in that reflection too, so that you have that future success as well.
And sometimes that's uncomfortable,
follow up.
right? Yeah.
Sorry.
I said, and sometimes that's uncomfortable because you're asking for feedback, and sometimes it depends on the relationship you have. But if they're honest, they might tell you how poor it was, and they might have ideas that you can kind of adopt for the next time around. So.
Yeah, exactly. I think we forget how valuable that is. Yeah, to think of where we're headed.
Yeah, I have another question, and I think we've maybe mentioned it earlier, but involving other stakeholders from your company in the preparation of an EBR. But what about if you're in an EBR and you're in this, your peer sales executive, account manager, account executives in the room with you, and they inject themselves into the presentation in a way that is a little disconcerting? How would you handle that? In front of the customer?
So I suppose it depends in what way. So taking over, is that kind of?
Yeah, because that can happen, right?
Yeah. I find though, I've had pretty good experience with, so I find for me, it's been kind of two ways. I haven't had, well, knock on wood, I haven't had the sales person like wanting to take over too much, but so it's been one of where like I'm not sure if they're going to be there or not. So there's that, because they're like they may find something else a higher priority at the last minute. So there's maybe that. And what that ties back to answer the question of like, how do you prevent maybe sales from taking over, is that preparation, involving them in the preparation, and like what is their role and what are we going to talk about? And actually sales is usually appreciated that, because then we kind of tag team and then we can actually leverage each other's roles to say, maybe here, we'll talk about that achievement. And then that's a good time then to say like, yeah, and we know that, you've got another team now, you've expanded on your end. Do we need to expand this opportunity or this like solution on our end too? So maybe the tag teaming and being really clear at the beginning hopefully can mitigate that, and so that you really look like a united front. And that comes for product too, because product is the other way. Maybe they're not used to being on customer facing calls and meetings, and so you really want to leverage their presence.
Yeah, I like that. I like the idea of teaming in advance with the sales here, because that's an excellent use case you just gave, where if they can identify even in the moment through discussion that there's an expansion opportunity, a salesperson would think of it as an opportunity. The customer is just thinking it as a challenge. And if they use the words properly, the customer would not see that as the salesperson just selling something. It would actually come across like they're trying to help solve a problem. So I think that's a tremendous way to demonstrate the partnership I keep kind of hammering on, which I truly believe is how you get success in business. So that's the end of our formal questions. And so the timing's pretty good. We could, the audience, if you have questions, please either enter in the chat or just come off mute and ask. I think it's fine too. Just looking through, did we miss any?
Yeah.
I have a question.
Matt has a question. He's raising his hand.
I think Raul mentioned first. You can go first.
Okay.
I already got to ask one.
That's no worries.
Hi, Raul.
Oh, hi, Julian. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Doing well, thank you. Thanks for presenting this. It's very useful. My question was more regarding on terms of timing. How close to the renewal do you think this is better to do it? Like too close to it, or just like a quarter in advance? Like thinking like if you wanted to do it too close to the renewal, might be in the way of that.
Yeah.
I don't know what's your take on that.
Oh, I'm actually very glad you asked that, because there was something that I didn't touch on in our questions that I meant to, and this can answer that too. It's really important to consider when your customer's budget cycle is too. So the renewal date is key, but what goes hand in hand with that is the customer's budget cycle. So to know what that is, first of all, when do they need to have these funds in their budget, and then back time it from there. And sometimes it takes forever just to get it on the calendar too. So I feel like 6 months is totally fine to start figure out like when can we get this on the calendar, and to have it like at least 2 or 3 months before the decision needs to be made, just in case things can get pushed pretty easily these days. So that's my response.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think not too close to the renewal date, because as you mentioned, Ro, it might be in the way, getting like it's just too close. And you want them to have, as Julian said, time to ponder things and think about things with some lead time, ramp time up to the renewal date. So that's, I'd say, yeah, a couple quarters in advance would be ideal. Kaylee asks, she asks, would be curious to hear how you think about frequency and structure of, this is a good question, of EBRs differently in year 1 versus year 2 and beyond. Jillian, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, that does make sense. And especially it depends on how long the onboarding cycle takes too. So that's definitely it depends kind of an answer. In my experience, before, I guess kind of based on the first renewal date. So it might not be the same kind of an EBR that you would have in year 2 for sure, but it would be at least an event where you're visiting what's been achieved and how that relates to their goals. So it's I've heard lots of people talking about value realization and more of like a planning exercise. So if it means that that's what it is in the first year rather than a full-on executive business review, then that would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think the first year you're focused on, the customer is more focused on onboarding and starting to adopt. And keep in mind that in the first year, generally speaking, customers are pretty excited about you, about the solution, and you want to embrace that as much as you can. So you probably want to get in front of them a little more frequently than you would after they've successfully onboarded and they're adopting the product, they're starting to realize some value. I'm not saying don't see them. You actually, of course you want to, but you probably don't need to do this frequently. And as Jillian says, at that point, you're focusing more on, what's deepening the relationship, understanding what more they can do with the solution and that sort of thing. You probably don't need to do it on a quarterly basis at that point.
Yeah. Did somebody else have a hand up, or?
I did. I lowered it.
Oh, you look. Okay. Do you want to put it back up again, or
just to stop putting pressure on you and let those questions go? No. Like, I don't want to talk for too long and take up a bunch of time, but I do need to frame with a bit of context. I oversee 2 products as a customer success leader. Both of the teams are brand new, so we have very few relationships with our customers. One of them is a SaaS product, but one of them is like a legacy on-prem client server platform. So I know more about what to do with the SaaS one, but the problem we have on the on-prem is we don't have access to their environment. So we don't have access to usage metrics and statistics and anything about how they're using the platform. And we don't have strong, solid relationships yet to have champions help coach us through it. But I don't want to let too much time pass before we have these executive meetings or have some sort of executive meeting. So how do you approach that, understanding that we still have a support team, we still have like a professional services team. We still have product initiatives that we want to share and can build relevant information, but the customer success manager doesn't have a lot of value to add beyond like a facilitation standpoint.
So the question is then, does it make sense to do an EBR, or is it something different? And then the other part of the question is, I guess, who the stakeholders are too, like.
Yeah, maybe that's a good way to phrase it is, should we do an EBR knowing that we don't have like a solid relationship yet? Are we running out of time to build influence with those executives, or would it be detrimental to try and get in a room with them when we don't really have a relationship with a champion and understand what their executive priorities are building into that?
Yeah, I mean, I can say one thing quick was like doing more like a value realization review is one that name itself isn't something I've used just based on the use cases I've had, but that makes a lot of sense where you're looking for ways to learn more about your customer, and it may not involve an executive level stakeholder on the customer side yet, because if it's still early, and the bottom line is, yeah, I wouldn't schedule something that's not going to add value in some way for the customer. Yeah.
I would say not a formal EBR, but I think any constituent in your customer environment, even if it's just a team of users, I think if you understand how you would benefit them by providing them critical information, that's good. If you package it up properly, they can turn it around and start sharing that, at least the perception of you guys. And I think over time, your reputation as a reliable kind of vendor of product or service would grow. And I think that would be kind of an incremental way of extending or expanding your reach within the account, by making them successful and making sure they understand why they're successful. Then we'll grow from there.
Yeah, actually, that just reminded me of something that I should have said earlier too, is like when you're kind of wrapping up whatever your session is, we were talking about EBR specifically, but now in this case, it's like maybe it's a different level of engagement, focusing on the value, and to wrap your session or your meeting with like next steps, like so there's always something. So maybe it doesn't feel like you have value to add right now, but in your discussion, you will ultimately come away with, what do we need to do? So that's the value there, and the sort of hoped outcomes that Peter alluded to. It just might be on a smaller scale or a more granular level with day-to-day users.
Yeah, agreed. Anyone else have a question?
I have a question if there are no other questions. Peter, you mentioned that it's evidently a bad sign if attendance is dwindling over time for EBRs. What strategies would you employ if you did notice that was a trend?
Well, I think I'd get better at marketing these things, for one. So next time around, I'd make sure that any sort of communication, I would, again, what we talked about earlier, I'd work with the champion to craft a better kind of agenda, and get their ideas for what would resonate better with the crowd there to make them want to attend, and that, this time there's going to be better value for you. I don't think you need to kind of advertise like Nick Maida does on Gainsight with funny costumes and Taylor Swift. But I think there's ways that we all can drive up interest just through written communication, right? And I think if you just craft your email or however way you're going to announce these things in a way with that, I don't mean just visually appealing, that's important, but make sure that the content pops for them, and that you actually have to, of course, you have to deliver on that, so that the promise is kept, right? But I think the marketing way is probably the way to do it, is to attract the audience, but then of course you have to make sure you can deliver on each piece of that content.
Do you invite the executives directly or have go through your champion to do it?
My recommendation is to go through your champions to make sure, because I don't think you'd want to go because let's say you went directly to the executives and you bypassed, you didn't even say anything to the champion, that could be upsetting for them. So you want to make sure you keep your champion on side and on your side and on board. That's probably not. I always took direction from my champions, wherever account I was in.
Yeah,
but I would encourage them to invite the executives.
Yeah.
Sorry, Jillian.
No, that's okay. I think from a logistical standpoint too, you would rely on your champion, your day-to-day champion, to be able to look at their calendar, even to suggest when they're available, because you don't want to bombard an executive with trying to figure out when they're available. So that's another reason to leverage the champion, and then that kind of establishes what the reason that you're having this interaction and meeting about.
And usually I would arm the champion with some sort of information about the solution that would be interesting for the executive, because they're aware of the projects taking place, but if there's a way you can connect to some sort of promised business value, then that would be interesting for them. They probably want to show up, right?
Actually, I have a question for the audience. Is anybody using any customer success tech stack in some way, like a solution that has transparency between you and your customer without email? So I guess having a shared Slack channel would be one example, but there's also like the customer portals that you can have in CS platforms. I'm curious how many people are using that and how effective it is.
We are lucky and unlucky enough to have a customer-led consortium where they actually have like Google groups where they're sharing information. So anyone can email a specific group and then customers respond to it. It's good because they're very engaged in it, but it also is customer owned. And so there's like a board of this consortium. And so they sometimes talk about our competitors' products in it, which is nice because we get to see it, but we don't
you're kind of like, okay, that's enough.
Yeah.
Interesting. That's very cool example.
Hi, Jillian, this is Eva. We use Showpad where we can actually specially curate pages that are just accessible by whichever customer we grant access to. And that's a great place for us to show any sort of thought leadership pieces, or even, again, going back to like product releases, like anything that is coming through that we know is going to resonate with their goals, we can put it in there. And then it actually creates like a little mini assets manager for them as well. So they don't have to go sifting through their emails. They can sort of come in here and find all of the things that we've been sending to them. So we're finding that's becoming more and more effective. And we're also starting to toy around with maybe having Google Drive access, but I don't know. There's so many considerations. I might report back on that one, but Showpad has been quite an interesting one.
Cool.
Yeah.
I have one. We have been using Microsoft Teams. For some reason, quite a few customers that I work with, they happen to use it. So they have provided us access with. So the only complicated thing is that you have to have different windows to be able to log in at the same time, because you have to have an email address from that company and they set you up. Okay. But once you get into Microsoft Teams, you get access to the chat, to like instant messaging with the client, but also access to their internal folder, so you can submit documents and everyone has visibility from both from the client side and on our end. As I said, the only thing that I think doesn't work very well is that you have to The login issue can be a bit tricky, having different windows, like different incognito windows, so that you're able to log in at different instances. But in terms of communication, direct communication with the client, I think that works very well, especially because of the chat feature directly with the client.
Okay, yeah, good to be in their platform, and that's a customer-centric approach for sure. Yeah, cool. Well, I see that we're just about at the top of the hour.
Yeah.
We are. So I want to thank you, Peter and Jillian, very much for your time today and your practical tips and tricks. I know that everyone feels better prepared for their next EBR because of your insights. And of course, I want to thank everybody for their participation today, taking the time and joining to learn from the experts here. Quickly before we go, we want to highlight a few different events and groups for you to check out. So first off, our next event will be in person. We spoke about earlier the benefits of in-person versus virtual, and we're really happy to have our first in-person event since the pandemic started in the summer. So stay tuned for more information about that. Also want to highlight the CS Circle. Jillian runs that. And of course, ESG as well, which Peter is currently spearheading a member of and working for. So please check out the CS Circle and ESG.
Great.
All right, thank you again. And I hope you have a fantastic evening.
You too. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.